Welcome to Classical Music Discoveries. I'm David Devine, and today we step into a fascinating cultural crossroads, a question that has shaped modern storytelling, performance, and the way audiences experience drama. Have movies replaced opera in today's world? Opera once stood as the pinnacle of emotional expression, a fusion of music, theatre, and spectacle that defined entire eras of artistic life. But in the last century, cinema rose as a new giant, capturing imaginations with its immediacy, accessibility, and global reach. Today, these two art forms coexist, influence one another, and compete for the attention of audiences whose habits have changed dramatically. In this episode, we explore how opera's traditions endure, how film has reshaped narrative expectations, and whether the silver screen has truly eclipsed the grand stage, or if opera still holds a unique power that movies cannot replace. Settle in as we open this conversation and trace the evolving relationship between two of the most expressive art forms ever created.
Here's a number that should stop you cold. In 1982, at what many consider the height of American cultural life, only 3% of US adults attended an opera performance. 3%. So when people say movies replaced opera, you have to ask, replaced what exactly? Today, we're digging into the real relationship between cinema and opera, what 4 decades of attendance data actually tells us, and why the answer is way more surprising than you'd expect. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how these two art forms have been quietly borrowing from each other, why opera's crisis might actually be its biggest opportunity, and what all of this says about how culture evolves. And to help us work through all of this, I've got someone who has been deep in this topic, so let's just get right into it. When you look at the big picture here, does the movies replaced opera story even hold up?
So the short answer is not really, but the longer answer is so much more interesting. Because to say movies replaced opera, you'd have to assume opera was once this massive, universal cultural force that everyone participated in. And the data just doesn't support that.
Right, and that 3% number really stuck with me. Even in 1982, opera was already a niche.
Exactly. The National Endowment for the Arts, in collaboration with the U.S. Census Bureau, has been running something called the Survey of Public Participation in the Arts, the SPPA, since 1982. And when you look at that first data set, movies were already dominant. 63% of U.S. adults were attending film screenings. Opera, 3%. So these were never really competing for the same audience at the same scale.
So cinema wasn't the thing that knocked opera off a pedestal. Opera was already on a pretty small pedestal.
That's a really good way to put it. And here's what makes it even more complicated. Opera's reputation as this elite, highbrow institution is actually historically inaccurate. Professor Alexandra Wilson at Oxford Brookes University has spent over 20 years researching this, and her work shows that in 1920s Britain, opera sat closer to what she calls middle-brow culture. It had a mixed audience, a close relationship with celebrity, and real connections with mass media.
Wait, so opera used to be more like pop culture?
In a sense, yes. And that's the irony. The art form that people now think of as stuffy and exclusive was once genuinely popular entertainment. Professor Wilson's whole research mission is to challenge that stereotype and show opera's hidden history as a form of mass entertainment.
That's a fascinating reframe, because it means the elitism we associate with opera today is kind of a modern construction, not some ancient truth about the art form.
Precisely. And it connects to a much bigger pattern in performing arts history. If you go all the way back, performing arts have always been reshaping themselves around new technologies and social conditions. Ancient Egyptians used music, dance, and theater as religious expression. The Greeks built it into their festivals. Then the Industrial Revolution comes along, and suddenly you've got circuses, vaudeville, cabarets, entirely new entertainment forms filling the cultural space.
So every era kind of gets its own version of mass entertainment.
Exactly. And in the 20th century, that new form was film. Cinema didn't just entertain, it became, as one source puts it, a powerful medium that captures the essence of our times, portraying the complexities of human emotions and the nuances of cultural diversity. That's a role opera once played, and film absorbed it at a much larger scale.
And film could do it cheaply, accessibly, globally. You didn't need to buy an expensive ticket and sit in a formal setting.
That accessibility piece is huge. One of the core critiques of opera today is exactly that. High ticket prices, formal settings, and what critics describe as a required level of cultural literacy that can make it feel completely inaccessible to younger or less affluent audiences. Film just doesn't have those barriers in the same way.
So let's talk about where opera actually stands right now, because the numbers you mentioned earlier are pretty alarming.
Yeah, they are. Opera America's 2023 annual field report, and this was covered in The Observer, revealed a 27% drop in attendance and a 20% decline in productivity compared to pre-pandemic levels. Opera companies are scaling back programming, doing fewer productions each season. It's a real crisis.
27%. That's not a dip, that's a collapse.
It is. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets nuanced. The NEA's 40-year SPPA data shows that this decline didn't start with the pandemic. The pandemic accelerated it, but the downward trend across nearly all art forms has been consistent since the 1980s. The COVID-19 pandemic isn't the root cause of the arts sector's struggles. It merely hastened declines that originated almost 4 decades ago.
So this has been a slow bleed for a long time.
A very slow bleed. And opera was never starting from a position of strength in terms of mass participation. Remember, even in 1982, it was only 3% of Americans. So a 27% drop from an already small base is genuinely existential for a lot of companies.
And I imagine the digital age makes this even harder. Like, why go to a 3-hour opera when you can stream something in 45 minutes?
That's exactly the tension. We live in what one analysis describes as an age of instant gratification, where entertainment is just a click away. Opera, with its long runtimes and intricate plots, is fighting against every instinct that modern media has trained into us. It's a real structural disadvantage.
Okay, but I want to push back a little here because I feel like we're painting a pretty bleak picture. Is there any counter-argument, any reason to think opera isn't just slowly dying?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the story gets genuinely surprising. Because the relationship between opera and film is not a one-way street where film just wins and opera loses. There's actually a growing movement in the opposite direction. Film is now feeding opera.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
So scholars published in the Opera Quarterly, this is an Oxford academic journal, have documented what they call an emerging repertoire where the movement goes not from stage to screen, but from screen to stage. Composers are now writing brand new operas based on famous films.
Like actual operas based on movies?
Exactly. Olga Neuwirth wrote an opera based on David Lynch's Lost Highway. Howard Shore, who you might know as the composer of the Lord of the Rings scores, wrote an opera based on David Cronenberg's The Fly. Hans Gefors adapted Hitchcock's Notorious. Mikhail Carlsen adapted Lars von Trier's Melancholia in 2023. This is a real documented trend that has accelerated in the past 2 decades.
That is genuinely wild. So opera is essentially saying, okay, you have the cultural currency, let us borrow it.
That's a great way to frame it. And the scholars at the Opera Quarterly ask exactly the right question. What motivates this sudden turnabout? Why are composers reaching towards cinema for their source material? And I think the answer is that film has become the shared cultural language of our time. If you want to reach a new audience, you start with something they already know and love.
It's almost like opera is using film as a gateway drug to bring people into the opera house.
Ha, that's one way to put it. And it's working in the other direction too. Opera is going into cinemas. Professor Wilson at Oxford Brookes was actually interviewed during a Royal Opera House live broadcast of Madame Butterfly that was screened in more than 1,000 cinemas globally. So opera is literally entering the movie theater.
Okay, that's a detail I did not expect. Opera in 1,000 cinemas. That's not a niche experiment, that's a real distribution strategy.
It really is. And it speaks to something important about how opera is trying to survive. Not by resisting cinema, but by partnering with it. Live streaming performances, cinema broadcasts, digital accessibility. These are the tools opera is using to fight back against its own irrelevance.
And there are artists doing really interesting work inside opera right now too, right? Like it's not just about distribution, it's about the content itself changing.
Yes, and this is where it gets really exciting. The Observer covered a discussion series called Opera Evolved, produced by National Sawdust with the Metropolitan Opera. And the artists involved are genuinely reimagining what opera can be. There's a young mezzo-soprano named Haley McAvoy who lives with cerebral palsy and plays a leading role in an opera called Sensorium X, which deals with themes of disability and artificial intelligence. That's not your grandmother's opera.
Disability and AI as operatic subject matter. That's a long way from Puccini.
It really is. And that's the point. The Observer piece argues that opera's true essence lies in its ability to convey the depth of the human experience, transcending barriers of privilege and accessibility. The art form doesn't have to be about grand resources and formal settings. It can be intimate, contemporary, and genuinely inclusive.
So the crisis is also forcing a kind of creative reckoning. Like, you can't just keep doing the same thing and expect different results.
Exactly. And the NEA's research on what they call trendbusters, arts organizations that are actually growing audiences while the broader sector declines, points to something really specific. It comes down to steadfast leadership, exciting programming, and an engaged community of supporters. And crucially, an unwavering understanding of who you aim to serve. The organizations that are thriving aren't trying to be everything to everyone.
That's interesting because it's almost the opposite of what you'd expect. You'd think the solution to declining audiences is to broaden your appeal, but the trendbusters are actually going deeper, not wider.
Right, and I think that's a lesson that applies beyond opera. The arts organizations that are surviving are the ones that know exactly what they are and who they're for. They're not trying to compete with Netflix on Netflix's terms.
Let's zoom out for a second because I want to make sure we're being fair to both sides of this. Is there a version of this argument where movies really did replace opera, not just statistically, but functionally? Like, do movies do what opera used to do for society?
That's the most interesting version of the question, honestly. And I think the answer is yes. In terms of function, film has taken on the cultural role that opera once held. Opera was the dominant storytelling medium that combined music, drama, and spectacle to explore the deepest human emotions, love, betrayal, moral complexity. And that's exactly what cinema does now, just for a vastly larger audience.
So it's less about replacement and more about inheritance?
I love that word for it. Film inherited the emotional and narrative ambitions of opera and scaled them up for a mass audience. And the technical comparison is actually fascinating. One analysis points out that opera weaponizes the unamplified human voice in a shared acoustic space, while film stitches together fragments of light and shadow to create illusions that can travel anywhere. They're doing similar emotional work through completely different mechanics.
And the mechanics matter, right? Because a live opera voice hitting you at 110 decibels in a concert hall is a fundamentally different physical experience than watching a film.
Completely different. And that's actually one of the things that makes opera irreplaceable in a specific way. The live acoustic experience, that unamplified voice filling a room, is something cinema literally cannot replicate. A film of an opera, as one analysis notes, loses that visceral punch of the live house. The intimacy of cinema is a different kind of intimacy.
So they're not actually the same experience dressed differently. They're genuinely distinct.
Genuinely distinct. And that distinction is actually opera's strongest argument for its own survival. There is something that only a live operatic performance can do. The question is whether enough people will seek that out and whether opera companies can make it accessible enough to find new audiences.
And right now, the numbers suggest they're struggling to do that.
They are. But I keep coming back to the Observer piece's framing, that this downturn in an already niche art form presents an unexpected opportunity. It can be a catalyst for innovation. And when you look at what artists like Davone Tynes are doing, redefining the boundaries of what it means to be a classical singer, you see that the innovation is already happening.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that gets lost in the doom and gloom narrative. The art form itself isn't static. It's been evolving for centuries.
Exactly. And that's the historical pattern, right? Performing arts have always adapted. Ancient Greek theater evolved into medieval religious drama, which evolved into Renaissance theater, which eventually gave way to opera itself, which then had to contend with film. Each new form doesn't erase the previous one, it just changes the landscape.
So opera is just the latest art form to face that pressure. It's not uniquely doomed, it's just in the middle of its own evolutionary moment.
That's a really generous and I think accurate way to see it. And the fact that composers are now writing operas based on films by Hitchcock and David Lynch suggests that opera is actively engaging with the dominant culture rather than retreating from it. That's a healthy sign.
Okay, I want to bring up one more angle before we wrap up because I think it's important. We've been talking a lot about attendance and institutions, but what about the emotional experience itself? Is there something about what opera offers emotionally that movies just can't match?
That's the heart of it, isn't it? And I think the honest answer is, opera offers something specific and irreplaceable, but it's not for everyone, and it never was. Even at its most popular, it was only 3% of Americans. What opera does, weaving intricate stories of love, betrayal, and moral complexity through the unamplified human voice, is extraordinary. but it requires something from the audience. Time, attention, a willingness to be in a room with something that doesn't fit into a 45-second clip.
And that's actually a feature, not a bug. The difficulty is part of the experience.
For the people who love it, absolutely. And Professor Wilson's work is really about making that case, that opera's themes of nationalism, corruption, race, sexual violence, identity, these are not dusty historical concerns. They're the exact conversations we're having right now. Opera just packages them in a way that requires you to slow down and actually sit with them.
Which is maybe the most radical thing opera can offer in 2026, the demand that you actually pay attention.
Ha, right? In an attention economy, asking someone to sit still for 3 hours without checking their phone is genuinely countercultural.
Okay, so when you step back from everything we've covered today, here's what this really comes down to. The question, did movies replace opera, is almost the wrong question, because it assumes opera was once a mass cultural institution that got displaced. But the data tells a different story.
Right. Opera was always a niche, 3% of Americans in 1982, and that number was already in a long, slow decline that predates streaming, predates the internet, predates almost everything we'd blame for it. What film did was fill a much larger cultural need for emotionally rich, narrative-driven storytelling. It didn't steal opera's audience, it built a completely new one.
And the 27% post-pandemic drop that Opera America documented, that's real and serious. But it's happening against a backdrop of opera actively reinventing itself. New works based on films, cinema broadcasts reaching 1,000 theatres globally, artists tackling AI and disability on the operatic stage.
And that reinvention is the most important part of the story, because the performing arts have always survived by adapting. The organizations that are growing audiences right now, the ones the NEA calls trendbusters, are the ones that know exactly who they are and who they serve. They're not trying to out Netflix. They're doing something Netflix genuinely cannot do.
So the takeaway isn't opera is dying, and it isn't opera is fine. It's more like opera is at a crossroads, and the path forward runs directly through cinema, not away from it.
Exactly. The two art forms are more intertwined than most people realize. Film borrows opera's emotional ambitions. Opera borrows film's cultural currency. And somewhere in that exchange, both art forms are finding new reasons to exist.
And here's the thing that I keep coming back to, that 3% number from 1982. We started this episode asking whether movies replaced opera. But if only 3% of Americans were going to opera even before streaming, before smartphones, before any of the modern distractions we blame for cultural decline, then maybe the real question is, what does it mean for an art form to matter, even when most people aren't participating in it?
And that's a question worth sitting with, because opera has shaped composers, filmmakers, storytellers, and cultural conversations for centuries, often from that same small, devoted audience. Influence and attendance are not the same thing.
Influence and attendance are not the same thing. That might be the most important line of this whole conversation. So next time you're watching a sweeping film score or a movie that makes you feel something you can't quite name, there's a decent chance opera built the emotional vocabulary that made that possible.
Thank you for joining us today on the Classical Music Discoveries. We hope this conversation has sparked new thoughts, new questions, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the art forms that continue to shape our world. As always, we invite you to explore more performances, interviews, and discoveries on our website and podcast channels. Your support keeps classical music alive, vibrant, and reaching listeners across the globe. Until next time, this is Classical Music Discoveries, where great music lives.